Hello, and welcome to God and Evil. I'm Brian Watson. And in this episode, we're going to get into the many problems that evil generates for all people. One of the most obvious facts of life is that evil is real. Things go wrong. We all suffer. We feel pain. We all have some sense that the world is not the way it should be, and that's very easy to see. You only need to look at the news. And regardless of where you get your news from, whether it's from legacy media outlets, whether it's from social media feeds, you just look at what's happening in the world and you understand that a lot of the news is bad news. We're told of wars, mass shootings, murders, sexual and physical abuse, political corruption, and many other misdeeds, both great and small. Such things are what philosophers and theologians call moral evils, the wrongs that morally responsible creatures do. There are also natural evils that we hear about, which range from things that we typically call natural disasters, like earthquakes and hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, that sort of thing, to diseases and even death. And oftentimes the damage that's caused by natural disasters is amplified by human incompetence or negligence. Of course, evil isn't just something in the news, and it's not new. If you look at the pages of history, you can see that there have been many evils that have occurred throughout history. And we only need to look back at the 20th century to see how awful things can be. You have 2 world wars, you have horrific genocides, atrocities committed by totalitarian governments. All of this demonstrates that we are capable of performing wicked deeds on a massive scale. Of course, you don't need to look at the news or be familiar with history to know that there are evils of all kinds in the world, because we witness evil firsthand. We all know people who have had diseases. A lot of us know people who have cancer, even now. Given the prevalence of sexual and physical abuse, each one of us likely knows many victims. We've lost numerous loved ones to death, and some of us even know people who've taken their own lives. And evil is not just something that happens to other people, it's happened to us. We personally have experienced evil. We've been wronged in some way. We experience emotional and psychological suffering of various kinds. Some of us experience anxiety and depression. We also experience natural evils, aches and pains. You might say that getting older is a kind of evil as we lose abilities, we lose strength, we lose whatever beauty we had. A great deal of evil that we experience is also associated with death, which is certainly one of the greatest evils, if not the great evil. In fact, Luc Ferry, a French philosopher, believes that much of our philosophizing and even a great deal of our religious beliefs exist as a way of trying to make sense of death or deal with death. So this is what he says in his book, A Brief History of Thought. He says, "A human being is the only creature who is aware of his limits. He knows that he will die and that his near ones, those he loves, also will die. Consequently, he cannot prevent himself from thinking about the state of affairs, which is disturbing and absurd, almost unimaginable." So death is the opposite of what we want. In fact, Ferry says, what is it that we want? What is it that we truly desire? In his words, to be understood, to be loved, not to be alone, not to be separated from our loved ones. In short, not to die, and not to have them die on us. And I think he's right. Death is a great enemy that robs us of so much. And even before our loved ones physically die and before we physically die, you could say there are a lot of little deaths that we experience as we go through life. There are the deaths of moments that we're experiencing right now, and then they're gone. The death of the past. There's death of youth and beauty and health. Sometimes we have dreams that die, hopes that die. We had a career that might die. We have relationships that break and aren't fixed. They're dead in a way. So much of our experience of suffering and evil has to do with death. But if we're honest, evil is not just something that's out there. It's not just something that happens to us. It's something that we do and something that is within us. We've all committed moral evils. I think we all, if we're being honest, regret things that we've done. We know there are things that we've done that we shouldn't have done. There are things that we failed to do that we should have done. We know that inside of us, we're not the kind of people that we should be. We don't always have the right thoughts. We don't have the right desires. And sometimes we relativize our own evil. We say, well, I'm not as bad as that guy. I'm not as bad as her. Or we try to justify our evil and say, well, yeah, I didn't do the right thing at that time, but it was a really hard season in my life. But the fact is, there's evil that we've done, there's evil within us. Which is why the Russian author Alexander Solzhenitsyn once observed, if only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? So you understand what he's saying. He's saying, it would be nice if evil were just done by a small amount of people, and making the world better was just a matter of rounding up those people and getting rid of them, whether you throw them in a prison forever or he said, destroy them. But he said, that's not the reality. The reality is this line dividing good and evil, it runs right through me, runs right through you. And how are we to get rid of evil in the world? It would mean getting rid of a bit of us, too. So in short, there are all kinds of evils in the world. Moral evils, natural evils, evils on a world stage, a lot of little evils in our lives. And often these evils seem to us as meaningless, pointless, evils that can't be made right, that seem to be beyond redemption. So evil is obviously problematic. And that's why philosophers and theologians refer to the problem of evil. And they refer to it that singular, the problem of evil. But in reality, evil produces many different kinds of problems, not just one. The reality of evil, with all its accompanying physical and emotional pains, it creates various problems for all people. So one problem that we all experience, regardless of who we are, is the existential problem of evil. We suffer, and we have to deal with that somehow. So regardless of who you are, what you believe, what country your family comes from, your gender, really even your age, it doesn't take long before we start suffering in our lives. We all will suffer. We all will need to find a way to cope, to just survive. Hopefully to have some kind of hope in the face of evil. The only alternative to coping with evil is just to check out. It's to commit suicide, which is an evil itself, and it's not something that most of us want to do, though obviously it is something that some people do. The reality of evil also generates a practical problem. So not only do we suffer and we have to just cope with it inside, but we want to find ways to eliminate evil, prevent evils, make evils a little less evil. That's the human instinct when evil comes. How do we deal with it? How do we get rid of it? How do we make things better? And so that creates a lot of societal problems or challenges. It creates political challenges. It creates technological and medical challenges. In fact, you could argue that a lot of, if not all of political activity is centered around trying to prevent evil or make certain evil situations at least better. We're trying to restrain evil in some way. Now, medicine is obviously aimed at preventing or curing the natural evil of sickness. So even those who aren't given to a lot of philosophizing, people who aren't given to a lot of sitting back and reflecting on the world and life and what does it all mean, they experience those challenges, the existential problem of evil, the practical problem of evil. But for those who are thoughtful people and they're trying to come up with some coherent way of making sense of the world, there is a philosophical problem of evil. We wonder why there is evil, where it came from, maybe even how to define evil. What exactly is evil as opposed to what is good and right? We wonder if evil can be reduced or restrained, even removed and defeated. I think that any worldview that is worth adopting should be able to explain to some degree why there's evil. And I think that any worldview that we want to have that's a livable one should provide us some measure of hope. It should tell us that there's a way for evil to be defeated. There's a way for evil to be at least transformed into something good. Now, this philosophical problem of evil is something that atheists will have to deal with. It's something that theists will have to deal with. There's one philosopher, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her last name correctly, but Susan Neiman or Neiman. She makes the bold claim that the problem of evil is the guiding force of modern thought. Now, whether evil is the guiding force of modern thought, it's certainly one of the guiding forces. We all think about why the world is messed up, and we want to figure out how the world can get better. So, this is a problem, as Naiman says, about the intelligibility of the world as a whole. We're trying to make sense of life. You have to think about evil. But yes, evil is not just a philosophical problem. It's often a theological problem. And it's not just for theists. I'm going to talk a lot about how theists, and specifically Christians, try to make sense of evil. So during the subsequent episodes of this podcast, I'm going to talk a lot about ways that Christians have tried to make sense of evil. But before I get to that, it's important to know this. Atheists have a problem of evil as well. And this deserves its own episode, so I'm not going to go super deep into that right now. But think about this. Atheists seem to have at least three problems with respect to evil. And one concerns whether there really are objective goods and evils. Sometimes we call this moral realism. Now, atheists, they're often called naturalists because they don't believe in anything supernatural. They not only deny the existence of God, but anything else that is supernatural, and sometimes they'll deny certain things that we think are objectively true, like good and evil. Now, it's possible that on naturalism, there are no objective moral truths to know, and there are some atheists who say that's just the way it is. So, for example, Michael Ruse, he's a naturalist, and he admits that much. He believes that whatever moral impulses or intuitions or beliefs we have are genetically determined. And according to him, these are his words, substantive ethics, claims like love your neighbor as yourself, are simply psychological beliefs put in place by natural selection in order to maintain and improve our reproductive fitness. There is nothing more to them than that. So on that kind of view, whatever we believe to be right or wrong, that's not reflective of some transcendent moral law that just exists regardless of what we believe, regardless of whether we exist or not. That's just kind of like a useful fiction. It's something that has been put in place through the long process of evolution. It may not be true, it just helps us to survive. Now, there are a lot of atheists who claim if there's no God, it just is the case that there are no objective values, there are no moral facts. Jean-Paul Sartre said, "It is very distressing that God does not exist because all possibility of finding values in a heaven of ideas disappears along with him." Friedrich Nietzsche said, "There are altogether no moral facts." And he said that morality has truth only if God is the truth. Richard Dawkins, a famous atheist, writes, "In a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces, and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but pitiless indifference. So, if we're here by some kind of cosmic accident, and we're here specifically, human beings have arisen by way of some, some form of a neo-Darwinian evolutionary account. We shouldn't expect there's any rhyme or reason. We shouldn't expect there's justice in the world. There's no good or evil. We're just here. We may not like the way things are, but who cares, right? Now, finally, one more example. Alex Rosenberg, he's a philosopher of science, an atheist. In his Atheist Guide to Reality, that's a book, he asks a question, and then he answers it. So the question he asks is, what is the difference between right and wrong, good and bad? And his answer is, there is no moral difference between them. And then he says, if you want to act a certain way because it makes you feel good, well, that's great. But there's no objective right and wrong. Now, I'm sure that there are some atheists who do not agree, and they would try to account for some objective moral facts, and even sometimes philosophers will talk about moral obligations. So it's not enough to just say this is wrong and that's right. We also need to have a reason to act a certain way, an obligation to do the good and not to do the evil. So I'm sure there are some people who would try to account for that on atheism, but I think it's really hard to do that. So that issue of moral realism is a big problem for atheists. Another difficulty for atheists concerns evil's positive function within their story of how we got here. And this might be a little hard to think about, but sometimes it's very useful to contrast different worldviews, kind of just line them up next to each other to see what they say about things. So let's think about the story of Christianity, just real broadly. According to the story of Christianity, the story we find in the Bible, God made a world that was good, and he created human beings to be his special creations. They're made in his image and after his likeness, which means they are made to be like God, to represent God, to reflect his greatness, to rule over the earth by first coming under his rule, to relate to him in the way that children would relate to a perfect parent. So they would honor their parent and obey their parents' instructions. We're supposed to do that for God. But the whole story is God made a good world. He made human beings. And at the beginning of the story of the Bible, there's not a trace of death. There's not predation as far as we're told. And yet, evil, which is linked with sin, it floods into the world as this alien intruder, something that corrupts the world and screws it up. And we're told that one day God will remove evil from the world. He will eradicate it. So God doesn't need evil. He doesn't need death to create different species. But on naturalism, our origin story is quite different. So naturalists appeal to some grand story of evolution to account for the diversity of all forms of life. And part of the way that such macroevolution works is through natural selection, as Michael Ruse already mentioned. So on that account, nature selects the more fit members of a species who happen to have some kind of advantage, some kind of genetic mutation gives them a beneficial trait. And they're able to survive better and procreate more, whereas the less fit organisms will die off. So in a sense, death is the mechanism whereby the strong survive and the weak are wiped out, and that helps the species as a whole get better and slowly evolve and so forth. And that's why it's not surprising that after Darwin's theory of evolution became more popular in the late 19th century into the early 20th century, that in the early 20th century there were a number of people who were embracing what is now called a pseudoscience, which is eugenics. And that's the idea, if we could only control human breeding, and that's the kind of the term that was used, if we could control who gets to procreate and who doesn't, then we could have a better human race. And so there are cases of people being forcibly sterilized people who were deemed not fit to have children. Now, fortunately, we backed away from that as we saw that was going to some dark places. But still, on naturalism, I don't think you can say with integrity that death is entirely bad, because without death, without predation, we wouldn't be here. That's something worth thinking about. Now, here's a third problem for naturalism or atheists with respect to evil. On their view, there's really no hope that evil will be defeated, that evil will be eradicated, that there will be one day when evil is stopped, it's just done with. Now, we can try to improve our lives and extend our lives through improvements in nutrition and medicine, but there's little hope that we can eliminate death itself. Now, you could just say, well, that's just a hard fact of life. That's just a brute fact. It's just, something we got to deal with. And I do think there are hard facts in life. There are inconvenient truths, especially when it comes to the problem of evil or the problems of evil. There are places where there are just hard truths that are not comfortable. They're just the way it is. But if the story of atheism is true, then everything ends in death. Our solar system will just one day die out. And someday just the universe will just, it'll run its course. And there's no hope there. Now, the atheistic problem of evil, it deserves more attention, but my focus throughout this series of podcasts is going to be more on the theological problems of evil for theists and usually for Christians. So in other words, I'm going to focus on the problems that evil poses for theists. Now, quite obviously, there are people who are not theists because they look at the world and they see evil. So evil has been called the rock of atheism. Like the atheist looks at the world, sees the evil that's in it, sees the amount of evil, the seemingly gratuitous, meaningless evil, and says, upon that rock I will build my non-church. I won't believe, because if there's a God who is powerful and all-knowing and he's good, how could he ever allow such evil? So they often justify their lack of belief in God by appealing to this so-called problem. Now, a lot of the arguments that are against the existence of God from evil will focus on a tension between two premises, or two, we might say, statements, propositions, whether they're true or not. There exists an omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly benevolent God. That's what theists believe. And the second one is evil exists. Now, I'm not going to deny the second one. I think that's just an empirical observation. You look at the world, things are messed up. There's evil. Atheists won't agree about the first proposition, that there is this omni-God who exists. But if you look at those two statements, you can see there's not an actual formal contradiction between the two. There may be a tension that exists between them, but there's not an exact, explicit contradiction. Now, some people may say, okay, well, that first premise about the omni-God, it might entail further premises. So if an omnipotent God exists, well, he has the power to prevent evil from occurring. If an omniscient God exists, he knows how to prevent evil from occurring. And if a perfectly benevolent God, a good God, a righteous God, a loving God exists, he would want to prevent evil from occurring. And you might say, okay, you take those statements plus the statement that evil exists, and now we're seeing there's an inconsistency there. And you can see how you could just either make an argument that ends with the conclusion that God doesn't exist, or you can make an argument that generates a contradiction. And either way, you're creating a problem for theists. So you could make an argument like this. If an omniscient, omnipotent, good God exists, then he would prevent evil from occurring. So in other words, if the omni-God exists, there'd be no evil. But there is evil. Second premise. So in other words, you're denying the consequent. You're denying the second half of that first premise. And then the conclusion would be, there is no omni-God that exists. Well, perhaps God has a good reason for allowing evil to occur. And that's generally the response of all different types of theists as they write about the problem of evil. They may disagree on what God's good reason is, but they're all saying, basically, this is my contention after having studied a lot of these, all, I'll say Christians, but I think it's probably true of all theists, they'll say either God has a great good in mind that opens up the door, doesn't necessitate evil, but at least creates the possibility for evil occurring, or God wants certain great goods that are only possible if there is first evil. So, for example, someone might say, well, God really desires human beings to have what's called libertarian free will. They could do this or not do that, and really the choice is up to them. But God can't control that, how people are going to choose freely. The reason he wants them to have that sort of unlimited free choice, if you will, not entirely unlimited, but simplifying for the meantime. The reason why he gives them that choice that he can't control is because that is necessary, some people say, for love. God wants people to freely love him. Or that kind of choice and will is necessary in order to be morally responsible, to be praiseworthy or blameworthy. And so God grants creatures that kind of free will, but he can't control it. And if they choose to use it to do evil, well, that's just part of the picture. Some theists will come at it from a different angle and say, well, God could give people a will that always chooses the good. But if there were no evil in the world, we would lose certain goods like bravery and victory over evil and compassion and perseverance and sacrifice. And Christians would say we would actually specifically lose the sacrifice of Jesus. We would lose the atonement, the crucifixion, and the triumphant resurrection. And the world would actually be a bit worse for there not being evil. So different Christians will come up with different justifications for why God would allow evil. But all we need to do, and this is the key point, is to say, all right, there's no logical contradiction here. As long as God has some good reason, then he's justified in allowing evil to occur. So there's no logical problem of evil. The fact that there's God and there's evil isn't some kind of formal contradiction. Now, some atheists will say, okay, fine, I'll grant you that. But why does God need to allow so much evil, or so much evil that doesn't seem to lead to any great goods? Couldn't he have made a world where there's just a little bit less evil, or maybe a whole lot less evil, and still have these great goods that he wants? And that's something that is sometimes called the evidential problem of evil, the idea being that the extent of evil, the amount of evil, the horrific, gratuitous, seemingly meaningless, purposeless evil in the world is great evidence against the existence of God. Sometimes it's called the probabilistic problem of evil because, yeah, it's logically possible that there could be God and this much evil, but this much evil just lowers the probability of God's existence. Now, one of those people who argues against this is William Rowe, and he likes to come up with examples of, why does this fawn need to die in the forest fire? Or why does this girl need to be raped and murdered? And these are, like things that really happen in the world. Couldn't God have made a world in which these things don't occur and he would still have great goods? Now, theists respond in different ways to these kind of arguments, and there's kind of two broad ways of responding. One is to create something called a defense. And it's just saying, basically, I don't know why evil occurs, but let's posit that this is a reason. So the person who's creating a defense says, I don't know that this is the reason, but let's just say it is. If this is possible, then God could have at least one good reason as to why he would allow evil. So a philosopher named Alvin Plantinga does that with this free will defense, that God has given creatures libertarian free will, because that is a great good, and he can't control how they will use their free will. And it just may be the case that everyone who has this libertarian free will is going to misuse it in some way. And so all the worlds that God could choose to create have some evil in them. But on the whole, the world that God chose to create is good, so it's worthwhile for him to do that. So it's just a way of trying to blunt the atheist's argument and say, well, wait a minute, there's no logical contradiction here. As long as this is possible, then you can't just say there's no God. More often than not, we find that there are theists who create things called theodicies. Now, that word was coined by a German philosopher, theologian, thinker, mathematician named Gottfried Leibniz. And the word comes from a couple of Greek words. So theos is a Greek word that means God, and dike is a Greek word that refers to righteousness. And the idea is God is righteous even though there's evil in the world. And so people who create theodicies, sometimes I'll call them theodicists, they come up with a plausible story. And that's what we're telling. We're telling a story, right? Okay, there is a God, and here's why he would create this world that, yes, has evil in it. And a lot of times theodicists will draw from their scriptures. So Christian theodicists will draw from the Bible and say, well, here are some things that the Bible kind of hints at, or here's a story that we get from the Bible, and it shows why there's evil, and yet it demonstrates that God is righteous. He's done nothing wrong in creating a world that has evil. Well, I am going to, in the due course of time, present my own theodicy. It was the subject of my dissertation. I recently completed a PhD in philosophy of religion, and I took time to analyze the problem of evil and come up with, I think, at least some suggestions for how to create a theodicy, so something of a methodology. And then I looked at a number of theodicies and at least one defense and saw what people tend to do in order to answer this problem of evil. And I'm going to go through some of that material in the due course of time. But what I'm going to do in the next episode is actually defend the very notion of creating theodicies, because some people think it's not a good thing to do. And I think as long as we're creatures who are trying to make sense of God's world, and remember we said earlier that the problem of evil, it creates this intelligibility problem of just making sense of the world. As long as we're in the world and we're trying to make sense of life and we're thinking about God and we're thinking about suffering, we're going to think about something. And so we want to at least get on the right train of thought with respect to that. And so I think theodicy is a legitimate activity, but I'll talk more about that next time. So just asking for the viewers' patience. If you're more interested in the subject, you want to learn more, keep joining me on this ride. Subscribe, share these episodes. And as I sign off for now, I'll leave us with a line that I very much believe to be true, and hopefully I'll be able to demonstrate is true in the future. And that is this: Jesus is the solution to the problem of evil.